religious family.
Hardcore Puritan, that's the way to think of it. You know, everything but the buckles on the shoes and the cap. And she tried moving to New York and creating a life as a writer. And every time she strayed a little too far, the pressure from the family pulled her back into the fold. Delia Bacon is one of the most underrated intellectuals in American history. And the more I learned about her, the sadder the story became.
An esteemed lecturer, now entrenched in Shakespeare, she developed a close friendship with a fellow lodger, Alexander McWhorter, 11 years younger, a Yale divinity student. Delia thought he loved her, and she wrote letters professing the same, but he did not. In fact, he read her letters out loud to amuse his friends. Yale Divinity School held a public trial to determine if he'd deceived her.
She was completely disgraced. The verdict went against her, and she was unmarriageable. She fled to England just to get away. She now had a mission. She was going to prove that others, led by Francis Bacon, no relation, were responsible for writing the plays and poetry of William Shakespeare.
It was deeply controversial, but she did have Emerson's backing.
She had Emerson's backing, and
Hawthorne went along with it.
Hawthorne bankrolled the publication of her unreadable book. Her Shakespeare was a radical, and the group of writers around Francis Bacon responsible for the plays and poems,
basically a cabal of writers that were trying to overthrow the
tyrannical regime of Queen Elizabeth and then King James.
It's a purpose thing and grows by plot to curb the will of the nobility. Suffer it, and live with such as cannot rule nor ever will be ruled.
And what she was trying to do was say, look, the received story of the foundation of all the values that Americans have from the Pilgrims who were religious dissenters is not true. The true spirit of republicanism, which is in this country, comes from these men, Francis Bacon and his cohort, who gave us plays like Coriolanus and Julius Caesar, which are radical anti-monarchical plays.
I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him.
Anybody reading this at the time must have thought, oh my God, she's trying to topple the very story of Thanksgiving, of Puritans founding the Republican values that give us our government.
Did Delia Bacon go crazy?
Delia Bacon lost her sanity in the last 2 years of her life, and a nephew came and rescued her, brought her back to the States, and she was put into a place for the insane, and she died 2 years later. But she certainly was not insane when she came up with this idea. She was quite brilliant.
She was the first Baconian, but there were notable others, among them Helen Keller, Walt Whitman, and Mark Twain.
Mark Twain believed you could only write what you knew because he tended to write about what he knew. His days on the Mississippi, his time out in California. He was one of the great autobiographical writers. So he was convinced that whoever wrote these plays had to have lived through those experiences. And he was pretty clear Shakespeare of Stratford could not and did not do so. He was a Baconian and a committed one. Twain and Helen Keller and others are part of this late 19th, early 20th century shift.
It was Keller who brought Twain's stunning new evidence of the Bacon theory.
This is extraordinary weekend up in Connecticut where Mark Twain is living, and Helen Keller goes up there with her friend and nurse who had recently married a Harvard lecturer named Macy. And Macy was a deep Shakespeare denier. And he brings with him a book which has these kind of acrostics. In other words, if you read all the way down on page 72 of the folio,
take the first letter of each line, it reads Francisco Bacano, or in other words, it inaugurates the great search for a cipher, a code embedded in Shakespeare that will ultimately and finally prove that it was somebody else.
And it makes great sense because this is the time where Morse code is invented, ciphers are huge.
So explain to me the motivation of Twain. I mean, he said, I have allowed myself for so many years the offensive privilege of laughing at people who believed in Shakespeare that I will perish with shame if the clergyman's book, this is the one about the cipher, fails to unseat that grossly commercial wool stapler.
Yeah, well, there's more than a literary rivalry here. I mean, Twain was the first great branded writer of our day. The white suit, the pipe, he even endorsed products. This was the guy who was a brand. And he had to figure, hey, when I go to my hometown of Hannibal, they're pouring down the streets and everybody can tell stories about me. If Shakespeare was as great as people say he was, why didn't people pour out in the streets in Stratford and write little bits? Doesn't make sense to me.
But why choose Bacon as the hidden bard anyway? Well, he did fit the era's model of what a genius should be. A Cambridge-educated parliamentarian and erstwhile Lord Chancellor, author of literary, legal, and religious works, proclaimed by some the father of the scientific method. Later, he was disgraced for taking bribes, and his poetry apparently stunk, but viewed through the right lens, he was a master of obscure arts, a principled, though thwarted power, a veritable Prospero.
But this rough magic I here abjure, and when I have required some heavenly music, which even now I do, to work mine ends upon their senses that this airy charm is for, I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book.
Prospero must be Bacon's creation. He must. Even though, after much exertion, the Baconians never found the hidden cipher to confirm it. By the way, that search did have an unintended consequence.
One of the people who got invested in the ciphers early on, a brilliant man named William Friedman, became a code breaker because of that. And he was responsible, along with others, for helping to break Code Purple, the great Japanese code that was responsible for the loss of so much life in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War.
So, victory in the Pacific.
Thank God for the Shakespeare controversy.
But the certainty that Bacon wrote the plays and expressed his personal pain through characters like Prospero gave way to another candidate as author, another character through which he spoke.
Bloody, bawdy villain, remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindness villain, oh, vengeance! Why, what an ass am I?
Hamlet was not a magician, or a king, or a fierce and fatal warrior like Macbeth. Hamlet was a kid, a tangle of impulse, desire, and doubt. Hamlet was modern. As Victor Hugo said in 1835, Hamlet is not you or I, he is every one of us. Hamlet is not a man, he is man. And he was just what the doctor ordered.
Sigmund Freud, at the tail end of the 19th century, was struggling. Freud's father died, and he was thrown into a powerful depression that he struggled to find his way out of. And he came up with a theory that we all know as the Oedipal theory, that men want to kill their fathers and sleep with their mothers. But the real story he was grappling with was not the great story of Oedipus Rex, but the story of Hamlet. So Hamlet gets rewritten not as a political story, but as a story of a man who is wrestling with the death of his father, and who can't kill Claudius, because Claudius has acted out his own Oedipal desires. Claudius has killed Hamlet's father, and Claudius has slept with Hamlet's mother, so you can't kill somebody for doing what you deeply desired to do.
Why, what an ass am I? This is most brave. That I, the son of a dear father, murdered, prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell, must, like a whole, unpack my heart with words.
It all clicked for Freud. He was so excited because he had not only figured out how he thought everybody behaved in the world, but he also had solved the mystery of Hamlet.
And the fundamental fact was that Hamlet was written after the death of Shakespeare's father.
Yeah, Shakespeare, as far as Freud knew, and he got this from a biography by George Brandes, wrote Hamlet immediately upon the death of his own father, John Shakespeare, in 1601. Shakespeare's father dies. Shakespeare works out his Oedipal complex. Freud's father dies a couple hundred years later, and Freud works out his Oedipal complex and solves the mystery of Hamlet in one go. What a great day that must have been. He started promoting this idea, and everything was going pretty well until George Brandes wrote a follow-up book that indicated Shakespeare had written Hamlet before the death of his father. So if you're Sigmund Freud, you're left with two choices. One, say, my theory's still pretty good, but the basis of it is untrue. Or you could say, the only explanation has to be that William Shakespeare did not write Hamlet. Somebody else whose father had died, who had a mother he longed for, must have written it.
Enter Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, a one-time ward of Queen Elizabeth, writer, art patron, world traveler.
Yeah, I mean, de Vere was captured by pirates, and so was Hamlet. De Vere's father died young, allowing Freud to make the argument for that Oedipal figure. De Vere wrote poetry. He was praised as a writer, and
had 3 daughters like Lear.
there you go.
But the biography of de Vere is really a pretty dissipated guy, and who wasn't even in the country a lot of the time, and
Yeah, if you truly want to be honest about it, then you have to accept all the biographical details and read the life against it. For example, some of de Vere's aristocratic friends claim that de Vere had sex with an animal. Does that mean we read the end of Richard III, My Kingdom for a Horse, in a romantic way? I mean, if you're in for a dollar, you gotta be in for the whole thing. So it's a tricky road to follow.
another little bump in that road, his death.
Yeah, he died in 1604, before the last decade of Shakespeare's writing career. That has never been an obstacle for believers who...
So what plays did he write posthumously?
Well, he must have put in a drawer in 1604 before he died. Measure for Measure, King Lear, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, Pericles, and Pericles is written with George Wilkins. It's not just dead men don't write plays. Dead men do not collaborate with living writers on plays.
But many have believed those plays were put in a drawer. Such actors as Orson Welles, Sir John Gielgud, Jeremy Irons, Supreme Court Justices John Paul Stevens and Antonin Scalia, and filmmaker Roland Emmerich, who makes Oxford's case in the 2011 film Anonymous.
Why must you continue to humiliate my family?
The voices, I can't stop them, they come to me. When I sleep, when I wake, when I sup, when I walk down the hall. The sweet longings of a maid, the surging ambitions of a courtier, the foul designs of a murderer, the wretched pleas of his victims. Only when I put their words, their voices to parchment, only then is my mind quieted.
I think it's deeply disturbing to a lot of people to imagine that somebody grew up in a middling class who received a grammar school education, which is equivalent to a college education today, could write the greatest works ever written. Their gorges rise at that possibility. They don't want to believe it. They want to believe that you have to have money and prestige and access to do so. They don't fundamentally believe in the power of the imagination. One of the great things about Shakespeare deniers of all stripes is there's never a moment where they admit defeat. And I think they never get to that point because the world changes. Our notion of who Shakespeare is keeps changing.
As Ariel said in The Tempest, Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Up next, quite possibly history's most inspiring and perilous performance of Shakespeare. This is On the Media.
On the Media is supported by Audible, offering audiobook experiences on topics ranging from pop culture and the arts to literature and bestsellers. More at audible.com/listen. Audible, stories that surround you. And by Penguin Classics, publishers of the Pelican Shakespeare. The series features all the plays and poems newly repackaged for the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. Available wherever books are sold.
At WNYC, we rely on listener support. But what exactly does that mean? I'm Nancy Solomon, WNYC's managing editor for New Jersey. Because of our listener support, we have journalistic independence. When reporters pitch story ideas to me, I do not think about advertisers. I think about you and covering the important issues that matter. Show your support. Go to WNYC.org and click on Donate.
WNYC is supported by the New York Botanical Garden, featuring the Antique Garden Furniture Fair, April 29th to May 1st. Preview Party, April 28th. Tickets and info at nybg.org. WNYC listeners really listen and respond. They call in, post comments, and support the businesses they learn about on our air. Find out how to become a WNYC corporate sponsor at wnyc.org/sponsor.
This is On the Media. I'm Brooke Gladstone. So now we leave the Anglophone world of the past for the global community of today. The British Council recently conducted an online poll to gauge Shakespeare love in 15 nations. Topping the list, India, Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, China, South Korea. True, online surveys are not notably reliable, but still, it suggests that Shakespeare translates in ways English speakers cannot easily fathom. In 2005, in Kabul, Afghanistan, a brief moment when the Taliban had been pushed to the periphery, a carpet designer named Qais Akbar Omar helped launch a production of Love Labour's Lost. It began with the visit of a French actress named Corinne Jobard, pondering with some actors a production. The actors said yes to Shakespeare, but no to tragedy. They'd lived that for 35 years.
We looked into Midsummer's Night's Dream, but it doesn't coordinate with Afghan culture and customs.
But Love Labour's Lost did?
It did. Corinne actually came up with that play, but we didn't have access to the translation. So she told the actors there are 4 princes and 4 princesses, and these 4 princes take an oath that they are going to study for the next 4 years, and they will not interact with any woman, and they will eat 1 meal a day. And that sounded very much like Taliban, and all the actors laughed and said, what? Shakespeare actually came up with this 400 years ago? And Corinne said, yep. And so what happens next? And she said, well, then 4 princesses come to the court, try to talk to the king about some serious issues.
So they set up a tent for them.
Exactly, outside, which is again, like nomads always living in Afghanistan in tents everywhere all over the country, so that also has a little bit of connection to the Afghan history and culture. And then they said, what happens? And they said, all these 4 princes fall in love with these beautiful girls. And then what happened next? And they said, well, let's read the play.
This is one of the notable plays of Shakespeare where there are equal numbers of women and men.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, the women get to make the decision.
That was one of the most important message of the play, that we choose this one, because for 6 years the Taliban did not allow women to work, and they were locked inside their houses like prisoners. And in this play, the women get to make the final decision. It was a great message that no, women always had an important role in Afghan society, and let's revive that back by this play. Of course, that was happening already, but this play pronounced it a little louder.
And do you think the West has a misconception about that?
They do. They only know of the bloodshed and war, but there is also beautiful other things happening. For example, the love for poetry. We have something called poetry contest. You sit in a circle, and I recite 2 verses from Omar Khayyam, and you recite 2 verses from Rumi.
the great Afghan poet.
Exactly, yeah. The first word of your first verse starts with the last letter of my verse. And that goes on for hours. And also, it's not just random poetry. We have to talk about something. Let's talk about love, or let's talk about, I don't know.
So you're talking about alternating verses based on the last letter, and not just verses, but verses limited to a particular theme.
Exactly. People don't know these things.
Let's leap from your discussion of the importance of poetry to your problems with getting a translation of Love's Labor's Lost. You had to go to an Iranian translation from a famous poet in Tehran who had translated into Farsi all of Shakespeare's plays. I know that Dari, one of Afghanistan's languages, and Farsi are similar, but
very similar.
They're not the same. Did you run into a problem there?
Oh yeah, it was a huge problem. The difference between Dari and Farsi, so, you know, it's like the difference between old Shakespearean English with a modern day American English. But we started to read a little more. We got, you know, hang of it, and then we said, oh wow, this is actually very beautiful. And then by the time we gave the play to the actors, it was amazing. It was more like a poetry contest. Some of the actors, of course, could not read. One of our actresses was a digger.
I'm kind of skeptical that a specific variety would have that capability as opposed to others, but if you've done the research, what does it say about its drainage requirements in general?
And that's what's a little bit troubling. In our research, we found that one website might say it likes a drier type soil, another will say it can tolerate moist. It's not real wet, but it's a little bit damp over in the area that we're considering.
So we're not talking about standing water. We're not talking about a place where the gutters drain.
Oh no, not at all. No.
Well, you know, the serviceberry is a remarkable tree. We don't talk about it very much. It's underutilized in the landscape, but I've never heard of anyone who planted it who regretted it. The berries are very tasty, and the trees grow to a good size, but they don't get unmanageable. And as they mature, they put on a good amount of fruit, enough for you to share with the birds. So if there's no standing, you know, I'll tell you what, I don't know that we've ever talked about this. What you do, go out to the area where you're hoping to plant this tree, and take a couple shovelfuls of dirt out of the ground, and then get a bucket of water, and pour the bucket of water into the holes, and then mark how long it takes the water to leave the hole. And if the water's still there a day later, the drainage is probably not going to be good enough. But if the water is gone in an hour or two, that should be fine. But I think you may have already selected the perfect tree for the situation. Were you thinking about installing it in the spring or the fall?
Well, and that's the other thing. I know sometimes the fall is a better time to plant, but we were thinking of doing it in the spring.
Okay. Well, I would urge you that if you are going to do it in the spring, don't delay until it actually becomes summer. Summer planted trees are very hard to keep alive. But if you find the tree you want, and my advice to you is spend a little bit more, buy an older tree. Don't look for a deal here. Look for a good quality tree that's already a couple years old, has some good height, and then disregard any other tree planting advice you get from anybody else. You want to remove all the wrappings. You want to toss them away. You want to plant this thing as high as it was in the pot, or however you have to plant it to keep the root flare above ground. And then refill the hole with the soil you took out. Then when you're done and you have the tree planted high without any wrappings underground, then you can put a couple inches of compost around it as a mulch and let a hose drip there to give it its initial watering. The initial watering is very important. You want to let a hose drip at the base of that tree for a good 24 hours. I think you've made a great choice, Mayor.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your input, and I'm a longtime listener of your show and was so excited that I had a question to call in for.
Okay, well, thank you, Mayor, and again, good luck this summer.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, as promised, it's time for the question of the week. You Bet Your Garden producer, Alexis Landis, will get us started with this week's question, which we're calling, is it good compost or bad compost?
Yeah, nice Glinda impersonation there. Lucinda in the Germantown section of Philadelphia writes, I have been going to the recycling center in Fairmount Park and bringing home buckets of their free compost. But as I listen to you more carefully, I'm wondering if the compost is full of pesticides. An analysis from the soil lab at Penn State is posted at their website, but I don't know how to make sense of it. Can you help? I know I should make my own, and I'm working on getting a worm bin set up.
All right, first, nobody makes enough of their own compost. I have about 20 different systems going. A giant circle of metal fencing filled with shredded leaves, smaller circles of welded wire filled with shredded leaves mixed into coffee grounds, 4 black plastic composters with locking lids that are filled with shredded leaves that I mix my kitchen waste into, an indoor stackable worm bin that processes the rest of my kitchen waste, and last summer's tomato cages all filled with shredded leaves back in the fall. And I'll barely have enough for my own needs. In fact, I'll probably have to import some compost myself this spring for a special project I'm doing.
Can you get bulk compost locally? And how will you know if it's good enough?
I have 3 local sources. A nearby garden center, a big mulch dealer that sells supposedly premium compost, and my local municipal supply. I'm going to get a 5-gallon bucket of each of them and give them all the enhanced duct test.
Enhanced duct test?
Yeah, retired University of Maryland compost guru Dr. Frank Goen taught me the basic 3-step duct test years ago. Does it smell like rich black soil? Does it look like rich black soil? And does it feel like rich black soil when you pick it up and squeeze it?
And if all 3 answers are yes, it's a duck, aka good compost.
Exactly, and over the years I added 2 other tests. One to detect the persistent lawn grass herbicides that weren't around when I first spoke with Dr. Goen, and one I created to test for possible weed seeds. You fill 2 containers, regular plant pots that have good drainage, with the compost. In one, you plant a good amount of fresh seeds. Be sure to count them first. The other one you just leave naked. Then you water them both every day. If the naked one stays naked, it's not weedy. If the seedlings germinate well, in the 80% range or higher, and the young plants look healthy and vigorous, herbicides are not an issue.
Should you use any special kinds of seeds?
I was told that pea and bean seeds are supposed to be the best indicators of herbicides, but the Penn State Soil Lab used the seeds of a classic cucumber variety named Marketmore 76. My advice is just to use the freshest seeds you have on hand.
So, our listeners' Philly Compost went through a professional germination test?
And scored a perfect 100. It sprouted just as many seeds, and the seedlings were just as vigorous as from seeds planted in the control of a bagged soil-free seed starting mix. And that's what Al Ratty of the U.S. Composting Council said was the most significant number on the 13-page report. The Philly compost grew seedlings perfectly. And if seedlings grow perfectly, everything else is almost certainly going to grow well. Seedlings are the canary in the coal mine. And Al said that 100% was really the only number he needed to see.
But did the rest of the report have anything of concern?
Oh yeah, things like soluble salts, fecal coliform, lead, mercury, zinc, all really scary words.
I'll say, I don't want any fecal coliform or lead in my garden.
Well, good luck to you, because they're in every gram of soil on the planet. Now, the Fairmount Park compost had 25 milligrams per kilogram of lead. The EPA limit is 300 milligrams. The fecal coliform registered 4.5 on a scale where 1,000 units are allowed by the EPA. So this compost could be a poopy 100 times worse and still be way on the side of the angels.
Wow, my head is spinning. And you had to ask for help? You wrote a best-selling book on compost. Your TED Talk on composting is approaching 500,000 views on YouTube.
And you know, the day I stop reaching out to experts for help with stuff like this is the day we need to close down this show. My relative inability to immediately interpret those test results showed me that civilians have almost no chance. And I reacted emotionally to line items like lead and arsenic. In reality, they were detected at levels the EPA and the Composting Council considered to be, quote, incredibly low. But they were just scary words and random numbers on a page without some kind of context.
So what's a poor gardener to do?
I say do the enhanced duck test. Don't even think about using compost that smells bad or looks bad or that grows weeds or distorted seedlings. All gardening is a crapshoot. There are no pristine areas left here on Krypton, and even reasonably good compost is still going to be 100 times better for your garden than chemical fertilizers. Well, that was hopefully some helpful information about compost, now wasn't it? Luckily for you, the question of the week appears in print at the Gardens Alive website. To read it over in detail with lots more specific